So exciting. First time in 2 years we're all together. Yay! and we can all go back to 2020. You know, February 2020 was our last Sunday Salon in this space. And so it's so wonderful to be back here and to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming. You are just going to be so excited to hear the talk today. So I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm going to bring Betsy Jacks, our executive director, up here. I'm Lisa Foxmartin, the chair of the board. And on behalf of all our board members, we welcome you and look forward to seeing you at our opening show, the end of April, beginning of May. But thank you for coming today. And here is Betsy Jacks, who will introduce our speaker.
Hi, everyone, and I'm trying to recognize people through their masks. So I'm thrilled to see all these three-dimensional beings in our space. Lovely to see you all. As Lisa mentioned, this is really going to be a great talk. No pressure or anything, but we're very excited because Dr. Scott Manning Stevens is really just so full of knowledge that what we all need, and he's so generous in giving it. He is a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation. He is director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University. He is currently a 21-22 fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. And he's also a frequent consultant at museums. He's author of numerous articles on Native American art and also depictions of Native Americans in art. So it's on that theme that he's going to be speaking today. And so please give a warm welcome to Dr. Scott Manning Stevens.
Sego Skanagoa, that is a traditional Mohawk greeting. It's actually a question. Sego means still, and Skanagoa means the great peace. And it is asking, is it still the great peace with you? I hope it is with me. I'm delighted to be here, and I think that the fact that it's an in-person event is what tempted me most to this place that I love. And I live and work in Onondaga country at Syracuse University, the traditional central fire of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, erstwhile known as the Iroquois Confederacy, our settler name. And I'm delighted to be in the country of the traditional homelands of the Lenape, Mohican, and other nations that have called this place home in the past and still do today. So, I was struck when the first time I came here, which was not so long ago. There was a wonderful exhibit called Cross-Pollination that many of you may have seen, and I loved the sensibility of its relationship to coal historically, its relationship to the land now, and to issues around the environment, and the forward-thinkingness of such exhibits in a place that's mostly a place of memory and the past, also things revered in my culture and yours. And so the opportunity to talk about coal and some of the thoughts I have had when considering his place in the history of American art, but also in the history of representing Native Americans. I'm going to go through a few today because it has struck me for a long time. I'm someone who approaches coal coming from the west to the east, in that I have an appointment in art history at Syracuse and frequently co-teach a course with a wonderful colleague and art historian Sasha Scott called Cowboys and Indians. And it is about the art of the American West, right? Remington and co., but also the long history leading up to that art, and also the arts of native nations of the West, right? And so it's an opportunity to combine those things. We like to switch it up in that my colleague is non-native, and she teaches the indigenous arts, and I teach the cowboy arts. So, just to keep the kids on their toes. And so it's very confusing because my first name is Scott, her surname is Scott, so it's a muddle. But I've looked so often at those images and thought about the impact they make on Native American life today, right? Where most people's contact with images of Native people came from Hollywood, and before Hollywood, through people like Remington or Bodmer or Kaplan or any of those great painters of Native American life of the 19th century. But I rarely thought of Cole in that. We start our course actually with Cole's Oxbow because it's a good painting to teach people how to read paintings, right? It has the kind of light and dark, it has the sublime, it has the cultivated and the wild or savage. It's a really good 101 art history text. But then, as I got more and more interested in looking at Cole's landscapes, I recognized that what do I make of the often diminutive figure of a native person in his work. He is, as I like to say, not afraid to draw a tiny figure, as you know. Get out your looking glass, because often the painting's title may be the only thing that clues you into the presence of a figure, let alone a native figure. But I chose these bookends, as it were, to point out that it is not really just a stage in his career at the beginning or at the end, but rather he is consistent throughout his career of representing the beautiful, the landscape, the sublime, in including the figure of a Native American. And I think that their presence, because he is a landscape painter, and not a person dedicated to recording the images and looks of Native people like Kaplan was, like Bodmer was, like Miller to some degree was, or even Charles Bird King sitting in his studio in Washington, D.C. and painting visiting Native dignitaries. All of those people made careers out of painting Native people. Indians, as they would have said. But what is the Indian doing in Cole? And I think because it seems a question begging to be asked, I've spent some time thinking about how those function in my mind, and what I want to explore today is to contextualize it in both a larger art historical context and then in a socio-political context of Cole's time, right? So this is a painting from 1785 by Joseph Wright of Derby, an academic painter of Britain, and a completely fanciful representation of an indigenous American woman mourning the passage of her husband, the Indian widow. And it does all the kind of things that were expected of a sentimental / romantic painting of the day, right? It draws on the figure of a symbol of loss and this notion of the vanishing Indian, already a trope in discussing the Americas, even in the late 18th century when there are still hundreds of thousands of Native people across this continent. So the vanishing Indian is a kind of worthy object of melancholy contemplation. You can look at the passage of time, of human mortality, of absence itself. Right? And in this painting, look at the kind of what I call the Sturm und Drang of this painting. It's very rare that you get both lightning bolts and an active volcano, a stormy sea, you know, everything is going on, but she is unfazed in her contemplative mode, right? Because of her deep sense of loss, and there you have her husband's, you know, some of the objects associated with him as a warrior, his omnipresent tomahawk, the bow and arrow hung up. And again, this becomes a way of romanticizing a uniquely American theme, right? You have other, you know, elegies on churchyards and such in Europe, in a European idiom, but here's an American one. And I think this is part of that background of what we're going to be talking about with Cole. These two justly famous images of Catterskill Falls both include a tiny Indian figure, ta-da, and there. So right on the ledge there, and there he is from the other perspective. But, and I always think, like, what is Indian about that figure? Because it's so tiny, it's usually something about the skin tone, if you can see it closely, kind of reddish, and then usually always the inclusion of feathers in a headband, right? And that becomes, up until this day, if you ask a 5-year-old, draw an Indian, and it's just a stick figure, it will have feathers, right? And that's a long-standing part of our visual idiom for Native people in the United States. There was once a series of paintings done on the Navajo Reserve, the Dene Reserve, out west in the turn of the century, depicting them as they are. And when it was shown in New York City, this is around 1907, the critic in one of the papers said, "How are we to understand that these are Indians? They're not wearing headdresses." And concluded, "No feather, no Indian." No one wants to be reduced to a piece of apparel, but this is partly the fate of Native people, that when you're so frequently stereotyped as to become generically a figure, that becomes the official stamp of your quote-unquote authenticity. A word I think Native people have suffered under more than any other word. Authentic. Are you authentic? Do you speak your language? No, that was beaten out of my ancestors at schools set up to do so. Do you live on your traditional homelands? No, we were removed hundreds and thousands of miles away to Oklahoma or somewhere else. But these are all disappointments. Why didn't you show up in costume? Because we don't wear regalia at home, you know. These are still parts of what I call a very crippling situation that our young people find themselves in, when to be contemporary is to be inauthentic. You know, it's a bad thing to say the only good Indian is a dead Indian. It is a worse thing to say the only real Indian is a dead Indian. And yet this putting us in the past chronically, our authentic place, is part of this long tradition, right? Cole's not, this isn't him being anti-Indigenous, but this is him of thinking, what did this falls look like in quote-unquote Indian times? We know from writing around the period in the 1820s, 1826, when he visits the falls, that it was already a popular scenic spot, a tourist spot. There was a little pavilion within sight of this scene that he paints out, right? The stream could be controlled at this time, and sometimes they shut off the falls and then open the sluices to turn on the falls to the delight of visitors. Hardly nature raw in tooth and claw, right? And yet he wants to take us back to a more pristine moment to an earlier point, Indian time, let us call it. And that's where he signals this figure. When I first started looking at these years ago and saw the little native figure, I kind of thought of him more as a signpost. This is the United States of America. This is North America. We're not looking at the Rhone River or the Rhine or some lovely scene in Europe, but rather kind of posting it, marking it. The native person does do that in a way, but I think more importantly, the figure has to do with time and an imagined space, a wistfulness or nostalgia for something he could have never experienced in the first place, because by the time he got there, it was already a tourist site. Right? Here's another group of, I first encountered these when I was a graduate student and thinking about Cooper and his representation, or misrepresentation, let us be clear, of Native America. And because it came out in 1826 and was so incredibly popular, that Cole received commissions to do scenes from this, but the scenes are almost unidentifiable without better descriptive titles because, again, the minute figures. And clearly, Cole is much more invested in the representation of nature here than in the narrative of Cooper. For that, I applaud his good taste. But, there's a sense of the landscape kind of overcoming and radically reducing Cooper's characters. One is, Cora kneeling before Tianaderrah. You can't really tell that, I must admit. And the other is a native council. But look at the fantasticness of the surroundings. They're clearly not representing anything real. Not in Cooper's Indian country. These are more like the Rockies or the Alps, and then these monolithic stones, wholly, out of place. But this is romance, right? This is the romance of the place overcoming the romance of the story. Both of them, let's say, told in vivid technicolor, if we think of film and its own garishness in the 20th century. So there's a sense that the work being done, as it were, by these are the other two scenes. Here, the death of Cora, sometimes also alternately titled An Indian Sacrifice. It's kind of strange. And then you have Cora dead and Uncas, I believe, firing on his enemy, Magua. Again, the same thing, though. Really what he's interested in is the power of the landscape, the distant prospects, the thrill of what Church would later call our epic landscape, right? That Church kind of imagined the United States as not having history, because if we blank Indigenous history, there is none before settlers. And so we couldn't compete nationally with Rome and Greece and Egypt for that long history, that longue durée that gave them epic qualities. But we could, in Church's mind, compete with our landscape, which he dubs the epic landscape, right? So hence his Niagara Falls, his glorious mountains, and so on. And I think there's a hint of that in Cole already, that he wants to say, what is epic about this country is not necessarily even Cooper's story, but rather the surround of it. Now, I grew up in Western New York, right off the Tuscarora Reserve, which is very near Niagara Falls. And now the place is completely desecrated by casinos on the Canadian side and industrial blight on the American side, though a lovely Olmsted Park on Goat Island and the surrounding park itself on the American side. But again, when Cole went to visit the falls in 1830, right before he went back to England for the first time, right, he felt compelled to go to Niagara Falls to see it before he got back to Europe, because he knew he'd be asked about it and he wanted to talk about this other wonder and so on. And we were joking over lunch. I'm a fan of those moments in romantic poetry, and in this case with Cole, when the sublime sputters out and you're just not impressed, right? So he goes to the falls and produces a kind of giant meh. He just can't make himself love it. He says in his writing that, I need mountains. You know, a lot of water is not doing it for him. And I think that's a bit ungenerous, because they are spectacular when you stand next to them, just the volume of them, the sheer width of them, etc. But for what he was looking for, not the wonderful double cascade of Catterskill Falls and its caves behind it and so on, it was just a lot of water. The other thing is this view with the native figures in the foreground, right? Gorgeous fall colors, lovely, but this area would have been clear-cut in 1830, and was already being used as farmland and then some military installations, because this is the border of the United States and British Canada, right? The so-called Canadian Falls and the American Falls. So he would have never seen this, right? And again, this, to me, the kind of symbol of that is the presence of these native people in some version of what he imagines traditional clothing to be, and just to mark them as identifiably native, but again, an already nostalgic perspective of the falls. We know, we have actually an excellent idea of what it looked like in the early 1830s, because George Kaplan, the great painter of Western native people, he starts his painting career going west in Western New York, in Niagara Falls, where he paints the great Seneca leader Sagoyewata, or Red Jacket. He paints, he was very aged at that time, but he paints him with the falls behind him. And he does a remarkable, you could Google image search this, painting of Niagara Falls from an imagined bird's eye perspective, which is uncannily accurate, but you can see how developed the land is at that point. So we know that this is, not authentic, that word, but it is, of course, a way, I think, of him drawing on its ancient grandeur. The more I got looking at Cole's art, the more I also realized that he loves cycles, he loves epochs and eras, and that change, and the contemplative nature of that change brings about by its very nature. Who we were as a child versus who we become as a young adult or in our old age. All of them ourselves, all of them different, and yet consistently some line of identity throughout. And he does this, of course, in the Empire series and the Voyage of Youth, where you have a kind of savage state of mind, the savage state. Savage here he's using more in the French state, sauvage, wild, as opposed to violent and cruel savage, right? So I was telling my students, like the French can say une cerise sauvage, a wild cherry, and they don't mean it's cruel. It is just not domesticated. So his savage state, his sauvage, is not violent, practically Edenic. And he also likes, of course, pictures of Eden and the expulsion from Eden and after the flood. And so we see that he is fascinated by the changes on the land. And if we look at the stages of empire, you'll see, the one thing that is unchanging throughout those as the city comes and flourishes and then falls is that mountain peak in the back. That's your compass, your orientation, is the endurance of nature, its unchangeability, but the change of its context and surround, etc. And similarly with the youth, who is, of course, not the angel, but the little baby with its arms out, very youthful. But the sense that in the 19th century, and it's hard to know how much Cole thought of or even cared to think of ethnological speculation in the period, but it is a period of tremendous ethnological speculation, both in the United States and abroad. This is the period, the 19th century is the place of the pseudoscience of race, right? Of kind of scientific racism finds its roots not in the Middle Ages, not in the Enlightenment, but in the 19th century. I don't blame it on Darwin because I don't think of Darwin as a racist. But that sense of the evolution of mankind and species does filter into evolution of societies, and you get scholars like the American Lewis Henry Morgan, who made his famous work on my people, the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois. His study of the League of the Iroquois was a groundbreaking study, kind of the father of American anthropology, etc., in the 1850s. But toward the 1870s, he's beginning to think more broadly about race and the stages of civilization. And so he comes up with this tripartite, you have savagery, then barbarism, and then civilization. And he places different peoples around the world in different stages. And he's one of many thinkers like this. There's Thommensen, Danish ethnologist in the 1850s, coming up with a similar idea. And some of them are coming up with them independently, but it is kind of a desire to understand human difference, but also one that consistently puts Europeans on the top of the pyramid. Right? And so one of the more tragic parts of that way of thinking is that Native America finds itself a doomed race, and this becomes very much part of the writing of the period. We have the vanishing race, the doomed race, right? The where are they now? This used to be, etc. And as I said, these type of things, as they filter down into popular culture, whether it be movies or television or things like this, have a direct effect on Native American youth today. Every time they're, self-identifying as Indigenous, and someone says to them, "I thought all you guys were dead." "Oh, I didn't think there were any more real natives here." Any of those things. A little twist of the knife. One that we, grow up knowing, but it has a long history in these images. Indians, I guess we love sunsets because we're always headed into the west, and this is part of the grand declension narrative, right? A people in decline. That in 1491, we were 100% of the population, and we are just on a steady downward swing till we zero out. Remember, in the late 19th century, they weren't afraid of talking about these things, and it is announced by the Bureau of Ethnography that by 1920, we will be culturally extinct. So biologically, our remnant of descendants will be here, but culturally, the boarding schools and reservations will have done their work and beaten out of, ironed out of, exterminated or dispossessed our cultures to the point where we are no longer identifiably Indian. And it takes us back to this notion of authenticity and the poisonous position of being the inauthentic representative of yourself, right? When Curtis, the great photographer of Native Americans at the turn of the century, in those beautiful sepia-toned portraits of Native people from all over North America, travels around and he puts together his multi-volume, his opus on Native America, the opening picture, right, is a group of Navajos on horses riding into the sunset. And it's called The Vanishing Race. If that's how the book begins, why read further, right? Why read further? So this notion of vanishing, it's not invented by any means by Cole, but he is imbibing it, maybe as a newcomer. Maybe it's what he hears. He's moved to this region, and people say, well, this used to be X, or you have these funny names like Coxsackie because that's an old Indian word. But now there were doubtless descendants of Lenape and Mohican people living in this area, without question, as there are still now. But invisible to an eye, looking for that headdress and that attachment to I think you can only see them at sunset. So again, I look at the Tompkins-Matson, a lesser-known painter of historical tableau. This is one of my favorite, not because I like it, but just because, boy, it does all the work for me. I tell the students, now see what I'm talking about is actually true. Look at the title, right? The Last of the Race. 1847, the last of the race? I call that aspirational vanishing. I hope it's the last of the race. It would imply having this family group marooned in history on the edge of the sea, nowhere to go, nowhere forward, the doomed race. And this notion again of vanishing, what an insidious verb. Who vanished us? Vanishing. It's not a trick we did. Ta-da, we're gone. We are being vanished in American history, in American historiography, the writing of history. And 10 years later, I didn't include it, I should have. There's another painting by the Western painter John McStanley, similar group, but now in full plains costume, 1857, on the Pacific, at sunset, called The Last of Their Race, a very small tweak. Again, 1857, hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, before the big Indian wars of the 1870s have even occurred. And yet he's got them on the Pacific. In that painting, as I said, they're weirdly in plains regalia, so they have been pushed right out to the, California. And oddly, at their feet is a bison skull on the beach. It drowned, I don't know. But again, same family, pyramidal grouping, same composition. It's like an old favorite. So this habit of displacement is not just, it's not simply wished for, but it is expected. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I don't see any Native people around here. I like to think, when, as I said, we start the Cowboys and Indian course with coal because of the Oxbow, but we also talk about paintings along the New York frontier, because that's one of the first frontiers. right? West of Schenectady, when the United States becomes an independent country, is still Mohawk and Haudenosaunee territory, right? It hadn't been conquered. We weren't a colony of the French, the British, or the Americans at that point. We lose our independence then because we have allied with the British, believing in their promise that they will hold the proclamation line of 1763 and allow no further settlement into Indian territory. But that's the frontier. That is the frontier in 1783, starts at Schenectady. And the first frontier wars are going to be against the natives of going into the Ohio country, beyond the Appalachians, and so on. And that's partly why I start the class there, because the frontier, as we know, is endlessly moving west. Until Frederick Jackson Turner will announce in 1893 that the closing of the American frontier, that famous essay. I often come back to this because this is the erasure of history, right? One would like a native figure wandering around this scene because this makes it seem like the settlement of the wilderness that surrounds is completely passive, right? It wasn't bloody, it didn't require displacement. It's more the kind of seeping in of a little agrarian community or a hunting and fishing community into this gorgeous landscape. It's, again, another fantasy of the settlement of America as being without displacement. Homey, almost to the point of kitsch in my mind, but beautiful, peaceful. I love that the contemporary Mohawk artist Alan Michelson did a series of what he called cabins and huts in American history. And he did everything from Thoreau's hut at Walden Pond to the Unabomber's hut, another part of American history, and this cabin, right? So he does them in these beautiful, they're three-dimensional scale models based completely on the original. And he makes them out of this handmade paper. And this has the language of the Treaty of Greenville on it. Treaty of Greenville, 1795, Anthony Wayne's defeat of the Confederated Tribes of the Ohio country opens up for settlement all of Ohio and the Ohio country. The place where, just 20 years later, Cole's family will move before they end up here in this region. So Michelson is thinking about the impact of things like the Treaty of Greenville, which dispossessed that entire region of Native people and sent them packing west, right? And thinking of that, the bloodiness that leads to that treaty, the war under Mad Anthony Wayne against the Confederated tribes, and then the kind of complete peacefulness of Cole's little cabin in the woods, as both are markers of the history of settler colonialism in North America, but one of completely benign, rosy picture, and the other a document of war and its aftermath, etc. Right? So this sense that Cole has to be aware of this larger discourse. Painting in the 1820s, especially the late 1820s, this is the large national debate around Indian removal, right? A terrible term that will be concluded in 1830 with the passage by Congress of the Indian Removal Act. And that act says all Native nations east of the Mississippi must be relocated west of the Mississippi. He can't be unaware of it. Even if it doesn't touch this area heavily in his time period, it is a national conversation. And there are indigenous people in the regions he does travel to, right? There are Haudenosaunee people throughout the Mohawk Valley, Finger Lakes, etc., as there still are in the Adirondacks. And so he's got to be aware of this, but it never, you don't see a politicized representation of it. You don't see confrontation. He does very little outside of fictional works with native versus settler violence. You have The Last of the Mohicans, to be sure, but again, a work of fiction. And then there's a lost painting called Kochura's Curse. We have an etching of it, right, where you have a native person who's fighting settlers in New Hampshire and putting, laying a curse on them before, of course, he's killed. But those are illustrations to stories, right? That's a story by Lydia Maria Child, who wrote Hobbamuck. But you don't see any actual political, he doesn't do history tableau, right? That's not his interest. But one of the things, and this is the kind of downside about landscape painting. As beautiful it is, its beauty is a seductive blinding and erasure of the history of the land itself, right? If you think of how he curates his view to create a picturesque experience, so you're not, necessarily going to find that exact view if you go out in the world, and stood even where he stood, because he's tweaked it, as painters do, and he admits that. He's not hiding anything. He says that's part of the art of it. He's not just a machine that replicates what he sees. He's bringing that picturesque quality to it. Alas, I feel it does what the picturesque does for the landscape is also going on with historiography. The history, the writing of history. Like, historiography is the study of the writing of history. And it's being curated. U.S. settler history is being curated in terms of their interactions with Native people. It's being prettied up or toned down. Students rarely know the names of, major atrocities against Native people. Gnadenhutten, the Paxton Boys, things like this. They're lost. Some dusty monument in an out-of-the-way place may have them still, but they're not part of a lore that they understand. I was thinking of this too because, so it's William Cullen Bryant famously and Thomas Cole. I was thinking, what about William Cullen Bryant, right? And he is very much part of this world, but a man of letters. And if you were to read some of his poems, a thing not much done anymore. He was popular in his day, but as 19th century poets go, I don't think he's read much very more. Like John Greenleaf Whittier, but he has, poems called things like The Indian Girl's Lament, An Indian at the Burial Place of His Father, The Disinterred Warrior, right? These are common themes expected as, romantic, contemplative moments in his poetry, in which he announces in that last poem, they were a noble race, but they are gone now. And that assertion of absence in the face of your persistence for Native people is still shocking. Just like I teach this period of art, I also teach this period of American literature, And we read things like Lydia Maria Child's Hubbamuck or Phil Furneaux's At the Indian Burial Ground. And the students are always just amazed, especially the native students I have. One of them said, they like us best in the ground. You know, that seems to be when we're worthy of contemplation. And it is true that there's this sense of admiration, longing, nostalgia, but only after the fact. I'll stop with this image. This is a place I visited several times over the years. It is in Auburn, New York. That's in central New York, not far from Syracuse, south of us. And it's a monument built in 1852, an obelisk of types, in a spectacular cemetery, which is becomes a major Union war dead cemetery and well worth visiting for its just gorgeous landscape and everything else. But this is a monument to the figure Logan. Logan, again, very famous in the 19th century, right up until the early 20th century, as an orator, as a kind of native, primitive orator. So his speech is first published by Thomas Jefferson in his notes on the state of Virginia. And Jefferson offers it up as a species of indigenous, small I, indigenous rhetoric on par with the great rhetoricians of Greece and Rome. He says, we don't need a Democritus and we don't need a Cicero. We have Logan. And this was a standard thing in the McGuffey Reader, that was the standard reading textbook for America from the 19th century into the 20th century. And children, age after age, had to memorize this short speech about Logan, who has Logan wronged that you would do this? He's basically a last of, right, figure. And that last of figure is very important, as my colleague at the University of Minnesota, great Ojibwe scholar Jean O'Brien, points out in her book, Firsting and Lasting. Americans love to have the first steamship, first light bulb, first whatever. And the culture also likes to last Indian, last of the Mohicans, last full blood, last speaker of their language, last traditional chief, last clan mother, all newsworthy small items. Lasting. Logan is the last of his group, right? He's a Cayuga. Of course there are Cayuga people today. But he's a Cayuga Mingo, meaning those Cayuga and Mohawk people and other Haudenosaunee that settled in Ohio in the 18th century. And he's the victim of colonial violence, that he had helped some colonists in the past, but other colonists come to return and kill his family and dispossess him of his home. And he gives this kind of farewell type of speech, in which he famously ends it. And again, a thing you could Google, Logan's speech, super easy to find. Who is left to mourn for Logan? Not one. And that's what it says on that little white square. That's all it says. And to me, it's such a poignant, notion of the culture that produced it is the culture that killed him in his kind, but also wants to memorialize and make forever in memory present his absence. It's a memorial to his absence, and that there's no one to follow, so don't worry, right? Who is there left to mourn or avenge or to resist? Apparently, no one. And this is what Jefferson thinks makes a great speech. Well, I'm sure he did. So this is, something I always tell my students. There are monuments of this type throughout the country. I also teach a course on monuments, and that was before they started getting taken down. It's tricky because now I go to talk about one, and they're like, oh, that's no longer there, okay. Good, but also bad for my course. You know, like, one of the weird factoids about that when it comes to Native America is one of the first monuments, or the first monument to an American woman, who's not an allegorical figure, is to a woman, Hannah Duston, in Massachusetts history, colonial history, 17th century figure, who is kidnapped by Native people and held captive. But while her captors are asleep, she kills the 2 adults and 5 children and scalps them all and carries their scalps to Boston to claim the reward. She is the first woman, American woman, commemorated in a public sculpture. And still is, that sculpture's there, and she has her little scalps in the stone carving, right? And that's seen as triumphant, you know, local girl makes good. And that kind of colonial violence, we can walk by it every day and not contemplate, or see this as a distant prospect in the cemetery and not wonder what it is really announcing to us. And so I hope when we look at Cole's figures, we'll just remember for a moment that they're doing some kind of cultural work, something that places us firmly and sometimes irretrievably in the past as Indigenous people, or marks a melancholy passage of time, but is certainly not what he experienced. He is not painting from life, right? He is painting an imagined world that happily is imaginary enough that that's a fiction, that we're gone. We are still here. Lower numbers and much lower land base, but we are here. And I think it's worth considering when we look at the work landscape does in general. Thank you very much. Yes, sure. Please.
So in thinking about the key romantic figure in Cole's landscapes, and knowing that Cole was warning of the desecration of the landscape,
Right.
and at the same time the loneliness loss. Do you think there was also a sense of identification with that figure? In other words, perhaps, on a certain level, the Native American is a stand-in for Cole himself?
No, I think that's plausible to me, or I guess I think at least he wishes he had their view, like he had their experience of it. I think he might substitute in his own desires, right? Like, if only I could have seen it before the little pavilion or the on-off switch, before, the interventions that have been made, how must that have been, type of thing. And so I guess I think of him as standing in that, like they're vicarious viewers for him or something. I don't know if I think he's reflecting too much on their removal, because there's also that way of talking about vanishing or inevitability of things, like they had their time, now it's our time, as though there was no causality in that, it was just ebb and flow of nations and so on. But yeah, exactly. Right, and if we are to come back in a cycle, it would be after the cataclysmic destruction of empire, right? Yeah. Anyone else? Please.
I'm just curious, what would have been the kind of painting that you would have liked to have seen Cole paint?
I love Cole's paintings. I'm not here to say I wish he'd changed them. I'm happy to have the Native person in them, because without them we wouldn't have this conversation. They are a reminder whatever our level of interaction is with that. But I'm a big fan of Cole, and the picturesque. I mean, I tend to buy the artist's notion that the art of it is in the imaginative quality one brings to it. I had just been writing for a catalog on the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer, who, you know, is always praised for his photographic-like precision, as though we're given some kind of magical window into the past in 1833. And that's not what I think is great about him. And I also just can't believe it. You know, I don't think everyone had the same nose, but that's how he draws a nose, you know. And what I think is spectacular about him is his attention to native artwork on the clothing, and I think there's a sensibility as a fellow artist. He really loves what he sees. You know, it's like that great Renaissance artist, Dürer, the German artist, when he sees the stuff come to Brussels from Tenochtitlan, from the fall of Mexico, and he sees this Aztec jewelry and gold, he's stunned. He doesn't know, he couldn't believe that there's anywhere else in the world making such gorgeous things, you know. And I love that sometimes you get an artist looking at someone else's art and the process, and, you know, knowing what it is to make, and really admiring it. And I think that's what's great in someone like Bodmer. With Cole, I mean, I love that he has painted these landscapes, and I'm glad that native figure is there. Sir?
Could you comment on the absence of building or native cultivation or signs of their place on the land in the nature of landscape?
Right, well, and this is one of the things I didn't mention, but I always notice that why are they usually always so solitary, right? They're only one, and but I mean, because it gives no hint of community, kinship, anything broader than the individual placeholder figure. And, you know, perhaps by the time he had bought into the myth that we are not agriculturalists, or, you know, of course, when Sullivan's troops are decimating central New York during the Sullivan campaign in 1779, they're writing home that they've never seen such rich fields of corn or such large orchards in their lives as cover these parts of central New York. But to maintain the myth that we're just hunter-gatherers wandering around and therefore don't have a claim on the land, and that we're not, in the language of the day, improving the land, you had to evacuate all those details as well. And I don't think that Cole saw it and hides it. I think he's just bought the usual story that they were a bunch of primitive wanderers. They didn't, you know. I remember the great historian Francis Jennings back in the 70s, when asked about native people wandering, he said they didn't wander, they commuted. Yes?
Did Cole paint any pictures of Native Americans in the springtime?
Right, yeah, we are, the autumn of our life, autumn and sunset, it's all goodbye. I can't think of one, but as I was asked, we were talking about earlier, I was absolutely flabbergasted to find out that there's not a catalog raisonné for Thomas Cole, right? All artists, major artists, have a catalog raisonné, which is every work they've ever done. You find it, you give its provenance and so on. And some minor artists have them too, but not Thomas Cole. That just seems like, using the art history library at Harvard, and I said to the art librarian, is there a Thomas Cole catalog raisonné? And she said, well, there must be. And we got looking, and she was like, it just can't be. She said, we'd own it if they had one. You know? And yeah, so there may be, is partly the answer. If I had that tool to look up Indian springtime, I'd be able to better answer the question. But to date, I don't know of any. So, thanks. Yes, Gwen.
I'm struck by the painting of Niagara Falls.
Mm-hmm.
When he visited to that painting, was that, I mean, wouldn't that have been the same time period when there would be Haudenosaunee women selling beadwork, or was that before?
It's a little before. As far as I know, that comes more like in the 1850s. But there would be native people around, certainly. It's just there'd be also a lot of other more development there. He does do a number of views of the falls too. That's not, he's there. He does a number of sketches, which then later in the studio become paintings and so on. But that one's the most illustrative to me of that picturesque attachment of getting rid of the actuality of it and putting it back into a kind of primordial Indian time. Please.
Thank you, first of all, for all of this. I think this has really been super important to me.
Thanks.
Personally. But I find that I feel we're very much still in a sort of ethnological speculation, right? We're still, a lot of what you're saying still echoes very much in sort of even the rhetoric of what we understand of as white supremacy, right?
Mm.
The idea that the civilizational, the disappearance, that there's a threat that's happening, and there's countless examples of that happening. And I'm wondering if you think, or at the same time, never in my lifetime would I have thought that like the Smithsonian would be repatriating like Benin bronzes, back
Agreed.
to
Yeah.
Africa.
Yeah.
Because the curator described them as exhibiting them is exhibiting a kind of violence.
Mm.
I think it's kind of a lot what you're saying. So my question is, do you see sort of future sites or places or actions in which it can sort of push against this sort of counter narrative that's coming? We're kind of at war in more ways than one, but in terms of pushing back against this sort of same sort of civilizational, ethnological kind of fiction making that I guess sort of Fox News or whatever is put together.
I mean, it's a huge structure, right? And when they talk about structural racism, so it's a huge structure that is propped up on many sides by many different things. And so it's very hard to say how successful one can be. I'm mindful of a few things. One, of elders in my own community, when I've expressed exasperation at things about race and racism, saying, look, these things improve at a glacial pace, if at all, but they can all remember in their own lifetime, including my mother's lifetime, that, just off the reservation, you would have a sign in a store that said, no Indians, right? And this was the 1940s. And you could never do that today, not because the sentiment's gone, because it's illegal, but for a long time, not illegal, right? And so as pathetic of an improvement as that sounds, that is one of them, right? And I don't want to ever jump the gun and say, oh, we're in a great place right now. But I am beginning to suspect and talk about what I would call, if it's not too grandiose a term, an indigenous turn, in that I can't believe in the discussions we're having today, here, all over, across American schools, in the discussions we're having today, that there's really going back to the old, the savage redskin, blah, blah. I think most people realize that's done. Now, I know, good Lord, look at this country. You know, I've also at times said I don't know that I believe it's a country because it's so disunited that I despair at times when I think of, you know, the country coming together in World War II. I don't know that we could do that. Half the country would be like, no, that's not, we like that other side. Okay, great. No, I don't. I mean, there are times when I think it's outgrown its capacity to call itself a country or a culture. It's too divided, it's too separate. But I also believe we've gone really past a point where we could just easily slide back into a casual language of racism around Indigenous people. I don't see it, I don't experience with my students at Syracuse, non-native and native alike, you know, that, and it's not about wokeness or political correctness or any other asinine term. It is about, you know, because a student said, well, do you believe in political correctness? I said, I believe in common human decency. I don't know when people stopped being asked to be common human decent, but I just, you know, I said, I think we're at a place where there are some exciting things happening, and I see them here, I see them in things like the Benin bronzes, or any discussions of repatriation. 50 years ago, you gotta be kidding. You know, never. And so, you know, if I weren't ultimately hopeful, I wouldn't teach. You know, what's the point? And so, I just, you know, I'm if you knew me, I'm rarely accused of having a rosy view of things, but I'm not depressed, and I'm not permanently angry. I see hope, I see beauty, I see, you know, revivals of things, and I love that my native students speak Mohawk because they learned it as very small children. And they could go circles around me in what they say, what I know about the language. And that's because that's a hopeful thing. I said, but you know, the words, it's an agglutinative language, so the words just get giant. And I said, surely you can't text in it. And they're like, oh, come here. You know, so now I know the language is safe because you can text in it, you can do anything. And so there are moments like that that just give me genuine joy. That, you know, my dada, my grandmother, lived to be 99, and so it wasn't so long ago, like within 10 years, that she died. And part of what, you know, was so wonderful for her was that they had a program on the reservation. She was in the elder hostel, it was called. And so she's surrounded by other Mohawk people and the caregivers and the other people there. But the children's school, the children had to adopt a grandparent in the home and visit them and speak Mohawk with them. I said, this is what made her live to be 99, you know, in that she was sure that the language would die in her lifetime, even though there were still thousands of speakers. Just because it was the way when she was a kid that you don't speak it and you punish for speaking it. And here were little kids writing cards and talking to her. And I just saw this overwhelming sense of, like, who knew this pride in this thing that she thought was really destined to be taken away, now being taught to every child, you know? And I just think there are moments like that where I take some succor and say, good, there are good things. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for sharing your
My
speech
pleasure.
with us today. And thank you all for coming. And we look forward to strengthening our relationship with this community that is all around us. And aren't we so lucky? So thank you. And so please enjoy talking with Scott afterwards. And thank you all for coming. Our next salon is going to be the Thomas Cole Fellows are graduate students who are going to present their research material on April 3rd. So I hope to see you again then. Thank you.